Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Ben Bidwell, who's Director of U.S. Customs at C.H. Robinson. And today we're going to talk about navigating tariff changes in the trade environment. Now, it's not often that global trade news makes the headlines, but it's certainly the case, these days. When you see, the U.S. and China kind of imposing trade tariffs on each other. You've got things like NAFTA getting renegotiated. There's still lingering concerns and uncertainty around Brexit, and just a host of all other things. So what impact are these changes having on importers and exporters? And what are some of the things that companies can do to kind of minimize the risks and successfully navigate through all these changes? Well, that's going to be the main, focus of our discussion today. And it's great to have, Ben with us, who's kind of in the front lines of this in his role there at C.H. Robinson, to kind of share his insights and advice on this topic. So, Ben, welcome to the program.
Great. Thank you very much for having me, Adrian. There's, as you mentioned, there's certainly been a ton of things going on with these tariffs and all of these changes that you mentioned. It's funny, I think just this morning there was an article that came out that was talking about, I think of the 110 S&P 500 companies that have reported their earnings for this quarter, 41 of them have explicitly mentioned these tariffs or had to answer questions about these tariffs. And I think that really just goes to the sheer magnitude of what all of this means.
Yeah, no, absolutely. These are things, I get the Wall Street Journal every day, and these are things you're seeing in the Wall Street Journal. You're seeing them even in, just general business, magazines. And to your point, you're having CEOs and CFOs talking about tariffs and talking about, trade agreements and so forth, because it is having such an impact on business results and, on the risk front, as well. So these are things that we're obviously going to dive into a little bit more in our discussion here. But, before we go into that, like I always like to do whenever we bring a new guest onto the program, I'm always curious how they got involved in this industry to begin with.
Sure.
So why don't we start there? I mean, tell us a little bit about your career path, how and why you got involved with, supply chain logistics, customs and tariffs and things like that, and kind of what your current role and responsibilities are there at C.H. Robinson.
Sure, absolutely. So I've been with C.H. Robinson for 14 years. Always been in the realm of customs and compliance in some capacity. And I really got into this. My mother was an import specialist with customs in the port of Minneapolis for almost 30 years. And I think growing up, hearing a lot of the different kinds of stories that she would share and things going on, it was always kind of in the back of my head that, hey, that's really interesting. Going through school, I never really thought about it much as a career, but sure enough, upon completion of school, I started with C.H. Robinson, and here 14 years later, I am responsible for our 25 global forwarding offices here in the U.S. that operate as a customs broker.
Wow, great background there, and kudos to Mom for kind of introducing you to the kind of the industry. So it was kind of there in the back of your mind all along, and you just didn't know it, that you were being prepared for this industry. And it's a great industry because as we can see clearly now, there's never a dull moment, and there's always things that are happening in this industry.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so like we've already talked about, I mean, trade and tariffs have been kind of in the headlines all year. So maybe as a way to kind of get the conversation started, I mean, can you give us a summary of, some of the biggest developments so far this year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really all started off with the Section 201 safeguard tariffs that we saw on solar cells, modules, and residential washing machines in February. That certainly had an impact, but in the grand scheme of things, I think that was pretty minimal. It just didn't affect that broader group of importers. Then, fast forward to March, and you had the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. That certainly was much more publicized, had a much broader impact. And then I think, as those tariffs progressed, we started out in March with some exempt countries. And then when that changed in June, I think it really started to have that full impact of what those tariffs meant. And people were really starting to pay attention. But again, that was still isolated to steel and aluminum. The big one, the Section 301 tariffs, unfair trade practices for goods coming from China. That's the big one. That's the one that everybody's talking about. And so really, so far, we've had 3 waves. We've had the July 6th implementation, and then we've had the August 23rd and September 24th, and these have obviously snowballed and really widened as far as the scope of commodities that they cover. And so right now, we're sitting on about $250 billion worth of goods that the U.S. imports annually that are now subject to these tariffs. Now, I guess what we're calling List 3, or this last list that went into effect in September, was implemented at 10% versus the first 2 lists that came in at 25%. Now, this List 3 is also the big one at the $200 billion. Now, I think what everybody's waiting for is January 1, and that's when this List 3 is scheduled to move from 10% to 25%. No, I think that's where we're going to really see an even stronger impact to these tariffs.
Yeah, and also a lot has gone on, and obviously there's the financial implications. There's the implications from from a supply chain standpoint in terms of importing and exporting strategies and what to do there when sourcing strategies. And then, for better or worse, this being an election year here in the U.S., there's the political side of things that are kind of weaved into all this. So I think it's kind of this perfect storm of activity that's helped to kind of amplify or elevate kind of the conversation, around all these things. So as these changes have taken place in kind of stages, and again, more things to come, I mean, what impact, when you talk to customers, when you talk to companies you work with there, what impact are these changes having on importers and exporters and other stakeholders in the industry?
I think it's really forcing companies to really take a good hard look at their compliance program, their import program. Everything old is new again. And so really, when you think about past programs that may not have worked for you, those may work now. Now that you have a lot more duty that you're paying on the table. Things as basic as tariff classification, which, not to say that in the past it wasn't taken seriously by a lot of organizations, but I think now it's certainly front and center in that spotlight. And that's something that a lot of folks are putting a lot more pressure on and making sure that their degree of confidence is much higher on their tariff classification now that you've got these big tariffs that swing with it. And then the one that I think isn't as broadly talked about as I think it should be is around bond sufficiency. A lot of importers have never had to deal with bonding issues because their effective duty rate was so low. So every importer needs a bond to import into the U.S., and the bond amount is calculated by taking 10% of the duties and taxes that you would expect to pay for the next calendar year. The minimum bond for a continuous bond is $50,000. The majority of importers traditionally have not needed anything over that amount. But now that you're looking at 10 and 25% tariffs on such a wide range of goods, that's really forcing importers to take a look at this. We've had cases where importers are needing 200, 300, up to $1, $2, $3 million bonds all of a sudden. And when that happens, that certainly can create some issues. The surety companies don't just hand out these bonds. They require financials, and in a lot of cases can require collateral. And those are things that don't happen overnight. And so I think one of the things that we've really been stressing to importers is take a look at this now before you get that insufficiency notice from customs, because once you get that letter, you don't have a lot of time. It's usually 15 days. And 15 days may sound generous, but when you're talking about, working within your organization to do things like get financials and, if you do need a letter of credit, or high amount of collateral, those aren't things that are pieced together quickly.
Well, this is all new to me, Ben. I really hadn't heard about this balance efficiency thing, and you're right. I don't think I've seen much, commentary on it. So it's certainly something that, based on what you just said there, I think it would be something that I think most companies ought to be, looking at, because
Right.
to your point, I mean, you should really be planning now for if and when that becomes, an issue, so that you can, have your ducks lined up to really take action, before in a more proactive manner rather than in a reactive manner, by
Right.
getting that letter from customs. Some of the things I've seen, so that's new to me. I think some of the things I've seen in the news, I've been, a lot of retailers and other companies importing, forward importing product, before the tariffs hit to try to, so building up their inventory here so that they don't get hit with the tariffs. And then with the product classification, I'm glad you brought that up, because, number one, I remember years ago, I was at a conference, and it amazed me that, there were these two very large brand name companies that were talking about how they did classifications, basically using, Excel spreadsheets and,
Right.
just bringing in, trade lawyers to come in once a year to kind of help them with classification. But it was a very much sophisticated process that they had. And I kind of scratched my head when I thought about the financial and the risk implications of what they were doing. But so
Right.
be it, right? But there was an article in the Wall Street Journal related to this just a week or two ago that highlighted how, and I'm just going to quote here what they said, how the business of code fudging is expanding in step with tariff increases. So, in other words, the article talked about how companies are looking at changing their product classifications or their HTS codes to potentially get around, these tariffs. Is this a good or a bad idea? And kind of what are the risks and challenges involved of going down that route?
Right. So, yeah, as you can imagine, this has been a very common question that we've been fielding from a lot of importers. There is risk associated with this. It's not just as easy as saying, let's just change our tariff classification. One, you need to ensure that it's right. Now, if you have been importing something incorrectly and you would like to change the tariff classification, there's no problem in doing that. But you can't forget about the past. And I think that's where a lot of people don't necessarily realize, wait, there's more to it than just looking forward. If you've traditionally been importing something and it's been duty-free and you realize, wait, this isn't correct, we're going to change the classification, and now there's a 3% duty rate. That may get you out of Section 301 tariffs from these, 25 and 10% tariffs. But now that you've got this 3% that you're going to pay going forward, you also need to look back and shore up the past 5 years of those imports, and make sure that you're paying customs for that 3% for the previous years.
And does it go back 5 years? Is that the time frame that you go back?
Right. And so it's just a matter of making sure. I mean, first and foremost, tariff classification has to be correct. And I think, the other question that we get from a lot of importers is, well, what is the likelihood that customs is going to find out? And surely we can't tell them 5, 10%, 30%. We don't know. But what we do tell them is that customs as an organization isn't stupid. They have very sophisticated technology, and they've got dedicated employees, especially around these tariffs, to make sure that they are watching import activity. And they may not catch you today, they may not catch you next month, But at some point, it does catch up to you, and the risk is not worth it. If you are subject to the duties, it's unfortunate for your company, but there are some things that you can do.
Right, right. No, absolutely. I mean, even in this whole area of product classification and making sure that you're doing it correctly is such an important topic, even absent all of the tariff changes and everything else that we've talked about. Because to your point, I mean, there's the case where you've been misclassifying and now you owe customs a lot of money.
Right.
But there's also the cases which the opposite. Hey, you've been misclassified, and you can get some of that money back, right?
Exactly.
So there's some duty drawback, possibilities there. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you really are complying with the the regulations and that you're doing things right. Which kind of brings me to kind of my next question is, all right, so in light of everything that we've talked about and potential different strategies and things you can do, I mean, what actions should companies take in response to these tariff changes and risk? And, how can, logistics service providers, the partners that they have, help them in this process?
Right, right. Well, I think, we've talked about tariff classification, and I think ensuring that you have a high degree of confidence in your tariff classification is first and foremost. Second, there's, programs in the past that may not have been valuable to you as an organization or necessarily worth it. And you did mention duty drawback, and that's a great example. We've talked to companies in the past that say, well, duty drawback isn't really worth it to us right now, or not something that we're willing to invest in from a time standpoint. In any given year, we only have the potential for maybe $10,000, and it's just not worth it. With these tariffs, that $10,000 might now be $100,000 or $200,000. And so, yeah, duty drawback is looking very appealing right now. And so that is certainly something that a lot of companies are looking at. And I mean, it's a part of almost every conversation that we're having. You have things like bonded warehouses, foreign trade zones. Now, the foreign trade zones aren't going to alleviate you of that Section 301 duty, but it is going to defer that payment to customs until you withdraw that from the FTZ. And so, I really think between those are kind of the biggest pieces to this as far as what can you do. You've got alternative sourcing locations. Now that is not as easy as I think a lot of people think that it may be, right? You can't just pick up your manufacturing process in China and move it to another country. But we are seeing that happen. It just doesn't happen overnight. And I think that those, especially as these tariffs continue, and if they continue, to go on longer and longer, I think that we're going to continue to see that trend of some production and manufacturing move to other locations.
That's a great point. I mean, certainly, at the beginning of the year, when kind of these things were being talked about, even, end of last year, right? We knew some of these things were going to be happening. One of the recommendations I was making is that companies should be already modeling and simulating all these what if scenarios so that they can, at least have a game plan defined in terms of what to do if and when some of these changes occurred, whether it made sense to, source from different locations or manufacture in different locations and, and so forth. I think a lot of questions for a lot of folks today is, well, is this just a temporary thing or is this going to be like the new normal, right? I mean, are we just playing, tit for tat right now? And then, miraculously there's going to be, a handshake between the US and China. And then, we're going to, unravel all of what's happened over the past few months. So I think, I think some of it is, standing by the sidelines going, what do I don't want to radically transform things because this may all kind of, the pendulum might start swinging back to normalcy, in the not too distant future. So I think that's part of the challenge that companies has. Do you hear the same thing or?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we get asked every day, how long is this going to go on? And, we don't have a crystal ball. I guess I don't see them going away instantaneously. If you look at how things have really played out between the U.S. and China from a trade relations standpoint over the last few months, there hasn't been a lot of positive vibes coming from this. And so, it could all come to an end next month, but I don't see the likelihood of that happening anytime soon.
Right. Yeah, and I think I agree with that as well. So looking ahead, you mentioned some, pending changes coming up now, January 1st, but are there other trade related risks, that companies should keep a pulse on and kind of heading into 2019 here?
Really outside of the tariffs, you've got things like NAFTA, which is now going to be USMCA. That's certainly something to keep an eye on. If you're involved in cross-border transactions, that is something that you should be paying attention to. There were a number of changes. I think that there were some pretty substantial changes around trade facilitation, de minimis, regional value content, things of that nature. But really, I think my biggest concern is some of the comments that we heard earlier in the year from the administration about a possible list 4 of these Section 301 tariffs. And I think, I can't help but get that out of the back of my mind of if that happens, which, they've been talking about if that were to happen, the administration could look to place additional duties on essentially the remainder of what we import from China, which is, would be effective on essentially $267 billion worth of goods. That would be an absolute game changer. And so, I think these are all things to pay very close attention to. If I look back to June and July when these tariffs were first being talked about, and you had mentioned, talking to companies about making sure that they're planning for all of these what ifs. So many of the comments that we heard back then from importers was, this is never going to happen. And then July 6th came and 25%. And I think that caught a lot of folks off guard. And so I don't know that there's any one thing I would say to watch for, other than keep up with what's happening within the trade environment right now, because really anything can happen.
Yeah, that's a great point. Staying informed, I think, is probably the number one, advice, because as you just said, all this can change for the better next month.
Right.
Or it could change to be even more challenging and disruptive next month as well, right? Right. In the not too distant future here. So it could go either way, and it's really anyone's guess. But I think, being informed and being prepared for different scenarios, I think, is the most critical piece here. Which kind of brings me to my last question, which kind of as a way to wrap up. What questions should companies ask themselves to assess whether they're well prepared to kind of successfully navigate to whatever happens with tariffs and the trade environment in the months ahead?
I think it all starts with are you comfortable with what you have in place today for your trade and compliance team? Are you confident that you have members within your organization that are staying informed and that are looking at all of these things that we've talked about, right? Tariff classification, duty drawback, foreign trade zones, all of these different aspects. But then, are you confident that you are working with a really trusted advisor and a trusted partner that is going to be watching out for your best interests? Whether that's your customs broker or a trade attorney or a consultant, do you have that partner that is going to help guide you through some of these things? Because we've talked about a lot of different things that companies can do, but it's not a one size fits all. Duty drawback sounds great, but it's not going to apply to a lot of companies. Foreign trade zones, those may work very well for certain organizations, but others, just given how they import and what their process is, that may not be something that would work for them. And so I think really making sure that you have that partner to help guide you through this. And, as things come out from customs and, the USTR and all these different things within the news, making sure that you have somebody that can sit down and explain it to you from how does this affect me? What does this really mean?
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, I think, with perhaps the exception of the very largest, importers out there, most companies do not really have the internal expertise and capabilities and knowledge to really understand kind of the broad spectrum of what's happening, or maybe what the broad spectrum of what the potential actions, to take. And when I view, that's how I view partners like logistics service providers, consultants, trade attorneys, customs brokerages, and so forth. I mean,
Right.
the wealth of experience and expertise and knowledge that partners like that can bring to the table and can provide some advice, I think is going to be key in navigating this, moving forward. Well, Ben, I mean, I think we could probably talk for like 2 hours about all the details of what potentially companies can do, what potentially might happen. But I think we covered a lot of ground today. You provided some great, food for thought and insights and advice. And, it'll certainly be great to kind of maybe get together in 6 months' time, 9 months' time, or maybe a year from now to see, what has changed or what's different and where we are from a tariff and trade perspective. So again, thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. I really appreciate it.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the C.H. Robinson website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Ben, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.